Hi YouTube, I'm Dawn, it's dusk, and today we are asking the unanswered questions of our knit sweater Jane Doe. If you missed yesterday's video, I'll have a link for it in the description box below, but basically in yesterday's video we just covered the case overview for our knit sweater Jane Doe. She was a young African-American woman whose body was left nude with one bullet hole through the head in a rural area in Illinois. Around her head was a trash bag taped with electrical tape and the knit sweater that her name is derived from. As with all Jane and John Doe cases, we are often left with a lot of unanswered questions. Unfortunately, I can't tell this Jane Doe's story, but I can begin to create a conversation about her simply by asking questions. So that's my goal in today's video, to ask questions about this Jane Doe and to start a conversation with all of you about who she may be. So we're going to start with questions about the investigation. The very first thing I wondered in this case, because it was so unpublicized, she only had one ad run for her in the Chicago Daily Bulletin with her face asking if anyone recognized her. One. They had no news coverage of this case at all, and I'm wondering if that's because she was an African-American female who was found in a rural, predominantly white area. Was her case just simply overlooked and not delved into because of her race? It was 1976. A lot of civil rights had been reached by that point in time for the African-American community in the United States, but still today there is racism in the United States. And I know that in the 1970s, in rural parts of Illinois, there was still racism in the United States. So I'm really wondering if the police department really didn't, I don't want to say didn't care, but didn't put in a lot of effort because they were in an area where people weren't going to push them into doing a lot of effort. Leads me to the next question. Did the ruralites around where her body was found consider her more of a city news story? She was found about an hour and a half outside of Chicago. So did all of the people there kind of just consider her a Chicago person Chicago should be worrying about? That may have just left her case untouched for so long. Luckily, in the last 2 to 3 years, the investigators in that area have reopened her case and really began to dig in and look at it. About how people in rural communities are looking at racial equality and looking at maybe the inequality that she faced at that time and really trying to undo that wrong. I'm not saying that's the case, but it does sort of appear that way to me. And either way, I think the positive in this is that now that community, although they are still predominantly white, is taking this case and recognizing that she deserves just as much attention as anyone else in that area who may have gone missing or been unidentified. They're really working hard at this case. The biggest questions I had when going through this case was they specifically mentioned she may have siblings who were unaware of her. This came from information that they got from a genealogy match. So I'm really curious, where do they get that idea from? Like, they say may, so they obviously don't have direct links to any siblings. I'm just really curious, why, I don't know, like, why would you say that? Why would you say that someone may have siblings who don't even know she exists? Is that just to like capture the public's attention, or like, how do you know something like that? Her body was found at 3 p.m. on a ditch in a rural part of Illinois by a farmer. And if you know anything about farmers in rural Illinois, they tend to like travel back and forth in a relatively smallish area, like probably 20 square miles if they're like driving on a tractor or something. So I'm really curious if this farmer had driven by that spot earlier that day, and then when they passed the spot again later, her body was there. Was this the first time they had passed that spot? Were they able to see her because they were higher up in a tractor than like someone in a car would have been? It's a highway, so I feel like it would have, been somewhat frequented throughout the day. There would have been other people passing that spot. Why did no one else see her body, but this farmer did? It really makes me wonder if her body was dumped there just really shortly before the farmer even drove by, or if maybe they were dumped there at the night, but it was farther down in the ditch to where only someone sitting high off the ground in a tractor could have seen her. Big question there is, did anyone else driving down that road see a body, see something, that looked off? or had the farmer driven by that area before and then spotted her body at a later date driving by? You know, is there any indicators that her body was maybe left there shortly before the farmer found her? Another question I have that is going to link to some more questions later was all of the mess of the blood, because she was shot in the head, was all of that mess contained within the bag, or was it leaking out around her? Was there any blood on the sweater or her body, or was it truly just contained in the bag? So after a genealogy match was made to an individual in Alabama, they ran ads about her in Alabama, but they also said that a sector of her family moved to Ohio. Did they run any ads in Ohio? And obviously this is another thing we're going to discuss about a little later that I already delved into in the case overview, so that's just one of the beginning questions on the whole Ohio ordeal. Now we'll move on to questions regarding her death. My first question is already kind of delving into the speculation of her being from Ohio, and is that, could her body have been in the car for a long car ride? Is there any way to know how long her body had been sitting in like one position prior to being left? I don't know if that's possible or not, but I'm just really curious if, you know, like maybe there was some dried blood on the bag indicating that she had, you know, been in a position in the car for a while, like maybe her head on the side and there was dried blood up here, or a pool of blood in a certain location that indicated that she had been left in a certain position for a while. Just something that would have shown that maybe she was sitting in the car for a long road trip. To me, like, the plastic bag really indicates, like, obviously they were trying to keep a mess from happening. If they were transporting her in a car, they would have kind of needed that mess to be contained, and a plastic bag would have been an easy way to do that. But maybe, like, the plastic bag, you know, had some kind of something left on it that could say how long of a car ride it was. I don't know, just like, you get what I'm saying, with the blood being dried maybe on one part of the bag and not the other, to show like she was in there long enough for blood to actually dry within the bags. Like, my biggest question, could she have come from Ohio, Cleveland specifically? To me, so many little things point to this. She has extended family that moved to Ohio. I-80 leads directly to Ohio, and the highway that she was found on connects to I-80. There's a large African-American population in Ohio. Obviously, there's also a large African-American population in Chicago, which is another place where she could be from, and I don't want to like downplay the fact that Chicago is obviously closer than Cleveland to where her body was found, and I-80 also leads to Chicago, which also has an African-American population. But the fact that she has that family linked to Ohio, I don't know, just something in my gut is saying, like, has that been looked into? Cleveland, Ohio is only a 6.5 hour drive from where her body was left. That is not a very long drive. That could easily be done in one day or one night. The question is, was it probable that the killer knew her personally? And I have this question because she had the sweater wrapped around her face. The plastic bag, you probably still could have seen her face through, but a sweater around her face, to me, that shows like they did not want to see this woman's face. They had guilt, they knew her personally, and they didn't want to have to look at her. My next question is, was she sexually assaulted? She was found nude, but they never mentioned anything about signs of a sexual assault. So I'm really curious, and we'll get into this more at the end of the video, whether or not there was a sexual assault. Because, like, I think we automatically assume there would have been a sexual assault if she was found nude, but they didn't mention that. So I wonder if there was any signs of that. The thing they didn't mention, and I think this just really plays back into the fact that her death was not investigated very thoroughly, but they didn't mention any signs of a struggle. They found her presumably one day after she had been killed. So there would have been signs on her body. Like, they could have done so much in this case. I don't know if they didn't publicize that they did a lot in the case, or they just didn't do a lot in the case. Either way, I wonder if there was signs of a struggle. And I asked this question, it's going to root back to some things that I'm talking on later on in the video, but if there are signs of a struggle, the gunshot came from behind her ear through her forehead. So my initial thought is either it's someone shorter than her coming from behind her, pointing up like this, or it's someone coming up around her, kind of putting, you know, one hand around her and using the gun like this in the back. Like, I don't know, you kind of see that in movies sometimes when people are holding someone hostage. But I feel like if someone would have done this there would have been some sign of her being held, you know, really strongly, bruising or something like that. So I wonder if there was any signs of a struggle on her at all. Which leads me to the question of, does the trajectory of the bullet indicate that she was shot by someone who was shorter than her? Because it's going up. If it's behind the ear and coming out through the forehead, it has to go up a little bit because your ear is below your forehead. So it has to be tilted up slightly. And that just makes me, like, naturally you think if someone's pointing a gun up, they have to be shorter, right? So it makes me also wonder, was the person who killed her a woman? Because she was like very average height for a man. She was 5'7" to 5'9". So that's pretty average height for a man. But for a woman, the average height is slightly shorter than that. So I could see a woman being shorter than her and coming up with that gun angle, or a man doing something like this. But if the man did something like that, wouldn't it leave some sort of mark? Also, then the man would have had to have been really close to her when she was shot, like really close. Found her one day prior to her being killed. Both Cleveland and Chicago are a distance, like a driving distance away, to where they could have murdered her and then also driven her body to that area. So it's plenty of time from either of those places for her death to also match up with being a whole day before that. And my last question is, and this isn't like something that I'm really speculating, but I think it's something that we need to look into, and it's the fact that the .38 caliber revolver was commonly used by police officers at that time. In fact, it was the standard cartridge at that time. So could she have been shot by a police officer who wanted to cover up her death? I don't know. I don't think that's very likely, but again, it's just something that came to my mind. Now let's talk about Jane Doe herself. The biggest question that any of us have, or most people have in this case, is that she was wearing a sweater with a handwritten L on it. And I wonder if it was a handwritten L or maybe a tag that looked handwritten and was a size large. The tag did have a handwritten L on it. It makes me wonder, you know, was her first or last name anything with an L at the beginning of it? Or maybe the person who killed her, it was their sweater and their first or last name had an L. She was taller than average, and judging by her weight, I'm assuming she was quite slender. So I wonder, did the sweater fit her? Is it a sweater that she herself would have wore, or could it have been another woman's? In the Jane Doe pictures, they have her wearing the sweater, but I wonder if they've like definitively like made the connection that it was her sweater because it fit her nicely. I don't know. I wonder if it could have been someone else's sweater as well. She had a relatively common, trendy hairstyle for the time. The sweater is on style for the 70s. She seemed like young, hip, with the times. Like she knew she's very pretty, beautiful, and she just seemed like the type of person to me who would have been more in their late teens, early 20s. Like if I were to guesstimate, and I know they said between 15 and 27, but just by her hairstyle and general appearance and the clothing that she was left with, I would guess between like 18 and 21, college age. So now at the end of this video, I just want to talk about my speculation for the case. This thing is, I really want to know, have they looked into Cleveland at all? Because it just seems like there's links there. I-80, which she was found not far off of, goes directly to Cleveland. They've already looked in Chicago for her. They've ran ads in Chicago for her with no matches. Yet Cleveland also has a large African-American population. It's a distance away that someone could have brought her body there. It would have made sense if they wanted to dump her body in a place where she was likely to be left unidentified, to do it near Chicago, a place where people are automatically going to link an African-American woman who was found an hour and a half to Chicago because of their African-American population. She's in a rural area. You know, I don't know, it just makes sense that Cleveland could be a possibility. The next big speculation I have is, could it have been a woman who killed her? The trajectory of the bullet, to me, indicates that it's someone possibly shorter than her. The fact that her head was wrapped so neatly to contain the mess, it seems like a female thing to do. Men traditionally aren't as clean as women. So I'm really wondering if it was a woman who kind of wrapped her up and taped her to kind of really secure the mess. And then the guilt of just having that sweater wrapped around her, again, just shows someone who, I don't know, I think women are more likely to feel guilty after something like that. And I wonder if maybe she was left unclothed without any signs of sexual assault because they wanted to humiliate her. Like, it's a woman who was mad or scorned by her, and they wanted to like leave her in a disgraceful way. That to me could make sense, for her being unclothed with no signs of sexual assault. No, if there was a sexual assault or not. That was never specified. Of course, it could potentially be a man who could have sexually assaulted her and maybe left DNA, or maybe again just wanted to humiliate her. And I think either way, whether it was a man or a woman who killed her, they knew her because they had that guilt. They wrapped the sweater around. They really contained the mess. It was just one shot. It wasn't, you know, a cruel crime where, you know, there was any kind of torture involved. It seemed very personal and very driven to specifically her. You know, they dumped her in a rural area. Clearly they didn't want to be caught, yet they wanted to get rid of the body as fast as possible because they didn't really find a secret place to leave her. They just left her on the side of the road. I don't know. So many questions. As with all of these John and Jane Doe cases, we are left with so many questions, and that's what this video is about. It's about asking those questions, getting the discussion started, you know, getting attention and light on this poor woman who for 34 years has been left without any attention or any light. And you guys, by viewing this video, are helping me bring light to her case, and that means so much to me. Thank you so much for taking the time to view this video and sit down and hear my questions. I would love to see your questions in the video box below. And if you would like to view another case with me next week, Monday I will be talking about another Jane or John Doe. And again, on Tuesday, I will be on with unanswered questions. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next Monday.